Someone tried to sell my home without telling me, so I bought their headquarters, and I didn't stop there. Ever wonder what happens when the wrong guy gets pushed too far by the wrong kind of HOA president? Let's just say she thought she ran the neighborhood, until the paperwork said otherwise. What started with a fake fee turned into a legal firestorm, a boardroom war, and one 911 call no one saw coming. This story has revenge real estate and a reckoning. Watch till the end and drop a comment. How far would you go if someone came for your home? The lake was still. But something about the silence didn't sit right that morning. Not peaceful, but waiting. I'd spent 2 decades solving other people's property messes. Plans I hadn't signed off on, and they were already in motion. At 42, this little cabin was supposed to be my reward after years of managing vacation rentals and dealing with broken air conditioners and demanding guests. My slice of heaven, where I could finally fish in peace. The morning light was hitting the water just right, creating that perfect golden shimmer that reminded me why I had worked so hard to afford this place. The phone call shattered everything. Some real estate agent I'd never heard of was on the line, and she sounded confused. "Excuse me, are you the owner of the cabin at 47 Lakeshore Drive? Because it's currently listed for sale in our system, and we have interested buyers." I thought someone was pranking me, like seriously pranking me. But no, they were actually selling my house like it was a garage sale table. The woman's voice was professional, matter of fact, like she was discussing the weather instead of my entire life being turned upside down. She knew the number of windows, the exact shade of green I painted the shutters last summer, even the new cedar swing I'd installed out back. Someone had walked through my private cabin like they owned it, and I hadn't even noticed. My phone nearly slipped from my hands as reality hit me. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or having some kind of breakdown, but this woman was dead serious about buyers wanting to tour my property. She mentioned specific details about my dock repairs, the stone pathway I'd laid myself, even the brand of outdoor furniture on my deck. I called Frank Delaney immediately. Frank's been my friend since college, and he's the kind of property lawyer who actually returns your calls when you're panicking. Within an hour, he was digging through county records and making phone calls to people I didn't even know existed. What he found out made my morning coffee turn to acid in my stomach. The HOA, led by President Lois Granger, had secretly and illegally listed my cabin for sale without my knowledge or consent. Frank's voice was tight with anger when he called me back. In 20 years of property law, he'd never seen anything this brazen. He kept repeating the same phrase, "This is criminal, this is literally criminal, Grant." When Frank confronted them, they had this absolutely ridiculous justification ready. Lois claimed I owed a community landscape enhancement fee of $3,847 from 3 years ago. A fee I'd never heard of, never received any notice about, and certainly never agreed to pay. According to her twisted logic, this gave the HOA the right to sell my property to recover the debt. Frank had combed through every single HOA document, and this fee appeared nowhere, not in meeting minutes, not in the community charter, not in any legal filing. It was completely fabricated, pulled out of thin air like some kind of bureaucratic magic trick. I called Lois directly, expecting her to be defensive or embarrassed about getting caught. Instead, she answered with this calculated sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Mr. Bishop, I was really hoping you'd call. You understand we don't want this situation any more than you do, but some of us care about preserving this community, Mr. Bishop, even if others have forgotten what that means." Her voice was dripping honey, but there was steel underneath every word. At 54, Lois Granger had perfected the art of polite intimidation. She spoke like a kindergarten teacher, explaining why a child needed to sit in the corner, but what she was really saying was that she owned me. The pause she left after each sentence felt calculated, designed to let her words sink in like poison. Within hours of that phone call, Lois began her character assassination campaign. She started telling neighbors I was a deadbeat who doesn't respect community standards and refuses to pay his fair share. I noticed the change immediately when I went to get my mail. Neighbors I'd known for years were avoiding eye contact conversations stopped when I walked by, and I could feel people staring at me from their windows. I waved at a neighbor I'd helped fix a burst pipe for last winter. He looked right through me like I was a broken bench on his morning walk. Whatever story Lois had spread, it was working. Every whisper felt like a gavel dropping on my name. At the grocery store, the gas station, even at the marina where I kept my small fishing boat. By evening, I could feel the entire community's opinion of me shifting like sand beneath my feet. That evening, I sat on my cabin deck holding the property deed in my hands, my jaw clenched with determination. The sunset that had brought me so much peace just that morning now felt like it was mocking me. As I watched the water, I suddenly remembered something that should have been a warning sign. My old neighbor, a guy who lived 3 houses down, had moved away suddenly about 2 years ago after some kind of dispute with the HOA. At the time, I didn't pay much attention, because people move all the time, right? But now, with Lois's tactics becoming crystal clear, I wondered what really happened to him. Had she done this same thing to him? Had he been another victim of her fabricated fees and character assassination campaigns? The thought made my blood run cold, and I realized I might not be her first target. I'm not the type of person who likes to flip tables, but if someone puts a table in the wrong place, I'll damn sure move it where it belongs. An anonymous community survey appeared in my mailbox that evening, asking pointed questions about problem residents and community standards. I caught someone photographing my cabin from a slow-moving car just after dinner. The siege had begun in earnest, quiet, and methodical, designed to make me feel paranoid and isolated. That day started with lake mist and coffee. It ended with legal threats, public humiliation, and a question no one had dared ask her before. What happens when the man you try to erase fights back? Frank and I spent the next few days going through every single document I'd ever signed related to the HOA. We cross-referenced, circled, flagged, and disqualified every fee and assessment from the past 5 years. Frank's conference table looked like a forensic crime scene. Every page was a piece of evidence, and we were hunting the body. Frank's conclusion was absolutely damning. The community landscape enhancement fee was completely fabricated. It appeared in no legal document, no HOA meeting minutes, no community vote records. It simply didn't exist anywhere except in Lois's imagination. We printed the full plat map and taped it to Frank's whiteboard. Red dots bloomed across the lake like infection markers. I counted 13 before I had to stop. My hand was shaking. Each dot was a homeowner who'd suddenly moved under Lois's reign. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear the more we looked at it. Frank called an old treasurer who'd resigned midterm 2 years ago. The man didn't say much, just muttered, "Check the Clubhouse lease, that's where the rot started," and hung up. That was the moment I knew we were on to something real. Frank frowned at something in the lease registry. "That's odd. The Clubhouse is listed under a trust, not under HOA control." I didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt like the first crack in their armor. We spent another hour researching property auctions looking for similar cases where HOAs had overreached their authority. What we found was a goldmine of legal precedents that would work in our favor. The emotional low point hit me when my neighbor stopped me while I was getting my mail. I'd known this woman for 5 years, shared holiday cookies with her, helped her carry groceries when her arthritis flared up. "Grant, I heard you were having money problems. Is that why the HOA is handling your house situation?" The pity in her voice cut deeper than any insult could have. I tried to explain, but halfway through my sentence, she'd already stepped back, hands tight around her shopping bag like I was contagious. The shame wasn't loud, it just lingered like mildew on my skin. I walked home that night and realized I'd heard kids playing down the road earlier, but the sound stopped whenever I walked past. Even my shadow seemed to clear the sidewalk. Through Frank's investigation and some discreet inquiries around the community, the real truth started emerging. Lois didn't just want to punish me for some imaginary debt. She wanted to sell my prime lakefront cabin to her friend Margaret for $75,000 below market value, then split the difference between them. It wasn't just theft, it was organized theft with a personal profit motive. When Frank laid this out for me, I actually had to get up and pace around his office because sitting still felt impossible. The scope of her greed was staggering. My cabin was worth about $400,000, but she planned to sell it for $325,000 and pocket $25,000 as her finder's fee. We researched fair market rates extensively to prepare for her inevitable counterattack, documenting everything that would make her scheme legally impossible to defend. Then things escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. I received a certified letter from the HOA demanding I vacate my cabin within 7 days. Attached was this ridiculous list of alleged violations that read like someone's fever dream. Non-compliant garden borders, unauthorized dock repairs, failure to maintain approved window treatments, and persistent non-payment of community fees. Half of these violations were for things that didn't even exist on my property. I'm looking at this list thinking, what garden borders, what unauthorized dock repairs? The dock had been professionally inspected and permitted just 6 months earlier. The garden borders were exactly the same as every other house in the neighborhood. She was grasping at straws, but dangerous straws that could still cut deep if I wasn't careful. Lois was doubling down on her propaganda campaign, telling anyone who would listen that I was financially troubled, refuses to follow basic community rules, and would probably leave in shame once the legal process is complete. She wasn't just trying to steal my property anymore. She was trying to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that no one would question her actions when I disappeared. I started wondering how many other people she'd done this to, and that thought kept me awake at night. The more I dug into community history, the more suspicious sudden moves I found. 3 families in the past 5 years had left abruptly after disputes with the HOA. 3 families who might have been victims of the same systematic theft I was now experiencing. During an emergency meeting at Frank's office, he gave me some crucial advice that changed everything. Grant, don't react emotionally. If you want to play in the big leagues, you need to wait for the right moment to strike. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned something that made my ears perk up. You know, I was looking into the HOA's structure, and did you realize the clubhouse isn't actually owned by the HOA? I wasn't sure where he was going with this, but Frank doesn't mention random details without a reason. Frank laid out his research and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The HO, a clubhouse, the center of all their power, where they held meetings and events and exercised their authority over the community, actually belonged to an old trust fund established decades ago. The current trustees wanted to sell, and the HOA only rented the building month to month. Their lease was set to expire in just 6 weeks. Grant, this could be their Achilles heel. If someone were to buy that building, they'd essentially control the HOA's entire operation. I stared at the property listing Frank pulled up on his computer screen. The clubhouse was listed for $340,000. Expensive, but not impossible for someone with my savings and property management background. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and I think I just found my cannon. Frank warned me to remember this wasn't about revenge, it was about leverage. Use it wisely, and I might not just save my cabin, I might save the whole community from Lois's tyranny. Frank leaned back in his chair and looked me dead in the eye. If we time this right, you won't just save your cabin. You'll take the boardroom right out from under her heels. I didn't sleep the night before closing, not from fear, but because I couldn't stop rehearsing the moment Lois would open that letter. I met with Megan Hartley, a sharp young real estate agent who came highly recommended by Frank. During our first meeting, she dropped a bombshell that made everything click into place. 6 months ago, Lois tried to sell the clubhouse. She asked me not to tell anyone. That's when I realized Lois had known about this vulnerability for months and had been praying no one else would discover it. She knew her entire power structure was built on rented ground, and she'd been living in fear that someone would figure it out. The fact that she'd been worried about it for months told me everything I needed to know about how devastating this could be to her plans. Megan and I devised a plan to hide my identity during the purchase. We picked a name so dull it would bore a search engine, Sunshine Property Holdings, registered to a P.O. box in Kansas. The paper trail was clean, dry, and visible. Frank's assistant handled filings like she'd done this before. We created a fake contact email, set up a borrowed voicemail system, and Frank's assistant posed as the purchasing agent whenever anyone called for verification. My years of managing vacation rentals had taught me how to navigate commercial property deals, lease agreements, and tenant rights. Knowledge that was about to become invaluable in ways I never expected. I wasn't trying to win some grand victory here. I was just tired of being pushed around by someone who thought she could rewrite the rules whenever it suited her. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The trust fund managers were desperate to sell after trying to unload the property for 8 months with no serious offers. When Sunshine Property Holdings came in with a clean offer of $335,000 and proof of funds, they jumped at the chance for a quick, no-hassle sale. I submitted the offer on Monday morning, they accepted by Wednesday afternoon, and we scheduled closing for the following Friday. One email, one counteroffer, one click. I owned their command center, but that's what happens when everyone wants the same thing. The trust fund managers wanted out. I wanted in, and nobody was asking complicated questions about financing or contingencies. I parked across the street with a ball cap pulled low, watched two HOA board members walk in with a stack of envelopes and a Tupperware full of Keysla cookies. They treated that building like a palace. I was about to become their landlord. The closing was surreal. I sat in a sterile conference room, signing document after document that would give me control over the building where Lois had been wielding her power for over a decade. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the exact same legal system she'd tried to weaponize against me. I hesitated over the signature line. For a moment, the pen felt heavier than it should have. Once I signed, I wasn't just the victim. I was officially going on offense. With every initial, I buried another inch of their control until all that remained was my name on their foundation. When the final papers were signed and the keys were handed over, I felt a rush of satisfaction that was almost intoxicating. For the first time since this nightmare began, I held the upper hand. I spent the rest of that afternoon researching comparable commercial properties to justify the rent increase I was about to impose. The Monday after closing, I sent an official notice to the HOA via certified mail. My hands were actually shaking a little as I wrote it not from nerves but from anticipation. Please be advised that the property located at 123 Community Center Drive has changed ownership. Effective immediately, the monthly rent will be adjusted to fair market value, $4,500 per month, up from the previous $1,500. Payment is due by the 30th of each month. I kept the tone professional and businesslike, explaining that this brought the rent in line with comparable commercial properties in the area. What I didn't mention was that I'd researched similar buildings extensively, and $4,500 was actually on the low end of market rate. I could picture the scene when Lois opened that letter during the next HOA board meeting, the current HO. A budget allocated $1,500 monthly for the clubhouse, and there was no way they could handle a $3,000 increase without either raising dues dramatically or cutting services entirely. Either option would make Lois extremely unpopular with the residents she'd been manipulating for years. The irony was delicious. She'd spent so much time trying to destroy my reputation that she'd forgotten to protect her own position. Now she'd have to explain to every homeowner why their dues were about to triple, or why they were losing their community center entirely. Within hours, my phone started buzzing with calls from confused and panicked board members. Some were angry, some were pleading, some were just bewildered. One of them left me a voicemail that ended with, "Please, we didn't know. She said it was temporary." Funny, that's what they always say right before the walls fall in. I didn't answer any of them. I let them all go to voicemail and listened to each message twice, savoring the desperation in their voices. These were the same people who'd stood by silently while Lois tried to steal my cabin, and now they wanted my help solving their crisis. One board member actually called me 6 times in 2 hours, each message more frantic than the last. That evening, I sat on my cabin deck with my coffee watching Lois's car speed past my driveway toward the clubhouse. She was obviously in crisis mode, probably calling emergency meetings and trying to figure out who dared to buy her building. I could only imagine the panic in her voice as she tried to rally her board members, the desperation, as she realized her carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling. Game on, Lois. Let's see how you like playing by someone else's rules for a change. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to show up. I just sent the lease amendment and let Lois try to explain to her kingdom why her throne now came with a $4,500 invoice. When I saw the envelope in my mailbox, thick official certified, I knew Lois wasn't just rattled, she was regrouping. I opened it at my kitchen counter, same place I'd signed the papers that made me her landlord. The invitation was printed on expensive letterhead with gold embossing like she was throwing a wedding instead of planning an execution. Emergency community meeting was underlined twice in red ink. She was pulling out all the stops, trying to make this look as official and intimidating as possible. The return address wasn't even the usual HOA PO box. It was printed from some law office downtown that I'd never heard of. She was trying to scare me with legal letterhead before I even walked through the door. I spent that afternoon calling Frank to make sure we had every single document ready, every piece of evidence organized in chronological order. This wasn't going to be a friendly neighborhood chat. This was war, and she was choosing the battlefield. Lois called an emergency HOA meeting for Thursday evening, and I received my official invitation in the mail. I knew this wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be a public execution with me as the main attraction. But I'd been preparing for this moment all week, and I was ready. As residents filed into the clubhouse, which I now owned, though most didn't know it yet, there was this palpable tension in the air. The room stank of too much perfume and panic. Fluorescents buzzed overhead. I spotted two neighbors I hadn't seen in months, arms crossed scanning the crowd like witnesses in a courtroom. The usual folding chairs had been arranged theater style, all facing a single podium where Lois stood like a prosecutor. Someone had even brought a gavel for crying out loud. The whole setup was designed to make me feel like I was on trial with the entire community as my jury. I could see people whispering behind their hands, pointing at me when they thought I wasn't looking. The energy in that room was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew this was going to be a showdown, and most of them had already picked their side before I'd even said a word. Some neighbors whispered supportive comments to me as they passed. Finally, someone standing up to her. Others looked at me with suspicion, worried that the HOA's collapse would hurt their property values. The room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway. Word had spread fast about the rent crisis, and everyone wanted answers. You could cut the tension with a knife, and everyone knew this wasn't going to be a polite community discussion. I noticed that several people had brought notebooks, like they were expecting to take minutes of my public humiliation. Some had their phones out ready to record whatever was about to happen. The room was too hot, or maybe that was just the blood in my ears. Sweat was beading on foreheads, but nobody wanted to leave and miss the spectacle. I realized that for many of these people, this was probably the most exciting thing that had happened in their quiet suburban lives in years. They were here for the drama, the confrontation, the chance to see someone get taken down a peg or two. Lois had clearly prepared for this moment, like it was the performance of her lifetime. She couldn't attack me too directly with so many witnesses present, so she framed the situation very carefully. We're dealing with an outsider who doesn't understand or respect what we've built in this community. Someone who is more interested in making a profit than maintaining the standards that keep our neighborhood safe and valuable. While her voice remained controlled, I noticed she was gripping her water bottle so tightly, her knuckles were white. Her pen clicked constantly during other people's comments, nervous energy breaking through her composed facade. She'd dressed for the occasion too, a navy blue power suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look like a Supreme Court justice delivering a death sentence. Every gesture was calculated, every pause dramatic. She knew she was performing for an audience, and she was playing her role to perfection. But I could see the cracks in her performance if you knew where to look. The slight tremor in her hands, the way her eye twitched when anyone spoke in my defense, the forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. In a moment that caught me completely off guard, an older resident I didn't recognize stood up and defended Lois. This woman has kept our property values high and our community clean for over a decade. Maybe we should trust her judgment instead of letting one disgruntled homeowner tear down everything we've worked for. A murmur of agreement rippled through part of the crowd, and I realized I wasn't just fighting Lois. I was fighting years of community conditioning, where people had learned not to question her authority. But then something unexpected happened. A man I barely knew, a retired dentist who once glared when I parked too close to the community sign, stood up and said, "I believed her. Now I feel like a damn fool." The room went quiet. I signed that petition against Grant last week. But after seeing these documents tonight, I'm starting to think we've been played. His voice was shaking with anger, but not at me, at himself and at Lois for making him part of her lie. No need to yell. Paper speaks louder than pride. I laid the folder down. Page by page, deed, HOA, charter, fabricated fee sheets. On the back wall, someone gasped when they saw Lois's signature stamped onto a non-existent bylaw. I presented clear evidence, my legal ownership of the clubhouse, the fake landscape fee that was never voted on or documented, and copies of all my attempts to resolve the cabin situation through proper channels. The room got very quiet as people started flipping through the paperwork, and I could see the moment when reality began sinking in for some of them. A 67-year-old retired teacher who'd been on the board for 8 years stood up slowly after reviewing my documents. I've been on this board for 8 years, and I can tell you honestly, I never voted on any community landscape enhancement fee. I've never even heard of it until tonight. His statement hit the room like a thunderbolt. Here was one of Lois's own board members publicly contradicting her story, and you could feel the power dynamic shifting in real time. Lois's face went pale, then flushed red, and I actually felt a little sorry for her in that moment. Lois's desperation tactics began immediately. She claimed I was under federal investigation for tax evasion, which was a complete lie. She threatened to sue me for harassment and intimidation. She ordered the maintenance crew to change the clubhouse locks immediately, even though she had no legal authority to do so. Finally, she declared the HOA would refuse to pay the increased rent and would fight this extortion in court. I let her rant without interrupting because every word was making her look more unhinged to the audience. When she finally stopped talking, I didn't raise my voice or show any anger. I simply stated the facts in the calmest tone I could manage. The rent payment is due by the 30th of this month. After that date, standard commercial eviction procedures will apply. I placed a business card on the table. This is my security company. They'll ensure no one damages my property during the transition. Half the residents looked shocked that I was actually serious about this. The other half, particularly those who had been quietly frustrated with Lois's authoritarian style, looked impressed that someone had finally called her bluff. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Lois stormed toward the exit, but stopped at the door to deliver one final threat. "This isn't over, Mr. Bishop. Not by a long shot." As Lois stormed out, she passed me without a word, but her eyes said everything. I hadn't just taken her power, I'd just made her desperate, and desperate people always come back swinging. October 3rd came cold and sharp, the kind of morning that felt like a warning. I arrived 10 minutes early, parked across the street. Frank's assistant wore a blazer 2 sizes too big and carried a clipboard like a badge. The 30th had come and gone with no rent payment from the HOA, just as I expected. On this morning, I arrived at the clubhouse with my 3-person security team and Frank's legal assistant serving as legal witness. It was time for a lawful commercial eviction, and I'd made sure everything was done by the book. I'd barely slept the night before, running through every possible scenario in my head, every legal challenge Lois might throw at me, every way this could go sideways. My security team was professional, but not intimidating, 2 middle-aged guys in polo shirts who looked more like golf instructors than enforcers, plus a woman who handled documentation for eviction companies across 3 counties. They knew the drill, knew the law, and most importantly, they knew how to stay calm when things got heated. I'd briefed them extensively about Lois's tactics, warned them that she'd probably try to provoke them into doing something that would make me look like the aggressor. Lois was already waiting in the clubhouse parking lot when I arrived, and she'd clearly been there for hours. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her eyes were wide with desperation, and her whole demeanor had shifted from composed authority figure to cornered animal. She was pacing back and forth in front of the building, like she was guarding it, and I could see she'd been crying. Whatever composure she'd maintained during the board meeting was completely gone now. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, running on pure adrenaline and rage. Her clothes were wrinkled, her makeup was smeared, and she kept checking her phone like she was expecting reinforcements to arrive at any moment. There was a thermos of coffee on the ground next to her car, along with what looked like the remains of a fast food breakfast that she'd probably been too nervous to eat. She kept glancing toward the street, probably hoping that a squad of lawyers would come screeching into the parking lot to save her at the last minute. But it was just her alone facing the consequences of her actions for the first time in what was probably decades of getting away with whatever she wanted. The moment she saw me, she started shouting before I was even out of my car. "This is theft. You can't just steal our community center. This is our building." I stayed calm and didn't engage with her emotionally, even though part of me wanted to remind her about trying to steal my cabin. I instructed my security team to document everything, while Frank's assistant took notes for the legal record. "Ma'am, this is a standard commercial eviction for non-payment of rent. You received proper notice as required by law." My voice was steady, but honestly my heart was pounding because I knew this was about to get much worse. When Lois realized I wasn't going to be intimidated, she pulled out her phone and called 911. She clutched her phone like it was a life raft, voice rising with each sentence. "He's dangerous. He has men in uniforms," she sobbed. Real tears this time, maybe. I half expected her to throw herself on the hood of a cruiser. She wept like a soap villain, auditioning for a bigger crime. "There's a man here with security guards trying to steal our community center," she sobbed into the phone. "He's threatening us and won't leave our property." I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. The audacity of claiming someone was stealing our property while standing on property I legally owned was breathtaking even for her. She kept glancing at the gathering crowd of neighbors, playing up her distress for maximum effect, making sure everyone could see her tears and hear her desperate pleas for help. She even threw in some dramatic gestures, pointing at me, accusingly clutching her chest, like she was having heart palpitations, stumbling slightly, as if she was too overcome with emotion to stand properly. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I had to admit if I didn't know the truth, I might have been convinced by her performance. When the police officers arrived, the situation looked bad for me at first glance. There's an official-looking security team, a distressed middle-aged woman in tears, and a growing crowd of confused neighbors gathering to watch the drama. It was exactly the kind of scene that could go very wrong very quickly, and for a moment I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. The words were calm, but my pulse wasn't. One wrong word and I'd be in cuffs. One of the officers told me, and my stomach dropped to my shoes. For one split second, I felt like I was going to jail for evicting someone from a building I legally owned. That's the HOA magic trick. Make the lie big enough, loud enough, and someone always believes it first. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like Lois's plan had worked. I might actually be arrested for trying to legally access my own property. But I stayed calm and handed the legal assistant the document folder. "Officer, everything you need to understand this situation is right here. I'll wait in my car while you review it." I wasn't sure if I was being smart or stupid, but I figured the truth had to count for something, and if it didn't, I was in bigger trouble than I thought. The lead officer methodically reviewed the documents while his partner interviewed both parties separately. Legal ownership papers showing my purchase of the clubhouse, copy of the rent increase notice sent via certified mail, copy of the non-payment notice and eviction warning, security camera footage from the property showing Lois's aggressive behavior. Within 15 minutes of reviewing the evidence, it became crystal clear who was telling the truth and who was putting on a performance for the cameras. Meanwhile, a 52-year-old nurse from the community had been recording the entire incident on her cell phone. "That's him," said a nurse I barely knew, filming from 10 feet away. "He's the one who's been honest since day one. I've seen her scream at kids. This ends now." Her recording captured Lois's erratic behavior and false statements to police. This recording would later become crucial evidence in my legal case. The nurse had been watching everything unfold from her kitchen window and decided to come outside with her phone when she saw the police cars arrive. She'd apparently been documenting Lois's behavior for months, waiting for the right moment to speak up. When the officer informed Lois that I was the legal owner of the property, her entire story fell apart like a house of cards. "You don't understand," she became increasingly frantic. "He's destroying our community. This has been our building for 15 years. He can't just take it away from us." She actually tried to grab the lead officer's arm, which didn't help her case at all. "You have to do something, arrest him. He's a criminal." I almost felt embarrassed for her at that point, because the desperation was so obvious. The lead officer gave Lois a stern warning about filing false police reports and creating public disturbances. His partner made it very clear that I had every legal right to control access to my property, and that Lois could face charges if she continued to interfere. "Ma'am, if this gentleman legally owns the property, he has every right to determine who can and cannot use it. That's how property ownership works." As the police cars drove away, I walked up to the clubhouse door and unlocked it with my new keys, while Lois watched in stunned silence. Lois didn't speak as the officers left, just stood there, jaw trembling, mascara bleeding. But something about her silence chilled me more than her lies ever had. She wasn't done, not even close. 2 weeks after the 911 incident, Frank and I officially filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Lois Granger and the HOA board. The charges included fraud for fabricating the landscape fee, defamation for spreading lies about my financial situation, property interference for illegally listing my cabin, and harassment for the systematic campaign to drive me out of the community. We didn't have a mountain of evidence. We had a scalpel, clean cuts surgically placed. Every item was a confession, even if no one said a word. Every lie Lois told had a paper twin. Frank had organized everything in color-coded binders that looked more like surgical instruments than legal documents. Each piece of evidence was numbered, cross-referenced, and backed up in triplicate. 3 days before the preliminary hearing, Frank got a call that changed everything. A 28-year-old former HO, an administrative assistant, reached out through a mutual contact with information that could blow the case wide open. I remembered seeing a young woman leaving the HOA office about 18 months ago, carrying a cardboard box and looking upset. Everyone said she quit, but no one ever explained why. Now I knew why, and it was so much worse than I'd imagined. Frank arranged for us to meet at his office the next morning, and I spent the entire night wondering what kind of bombshell this woman was about to drop. Jody revealed the shocking scope of Lois's criminal activities during our meeting at Frank's office. Systematic embezzlement of HOA funds totaling over $80,000 across 5 years. Creation of multiple fake fees to boost revenue while hiding the theft. A detailed plan to sell my cabin to her friend for $50,000 below market value, with Lois taking a $25,000 finder's fee. Threats against board members who ask too many questions about financial discrepancies. A pattern of targeting residents who posed any threat to her authority. I stayed quiet for a year, she said, holding up the flash drive. But watching her do it again, that was the night I stopped sleeping. My throat went dry. I thought I'd been angry before, but this was grief in another form. What Lois stole wasn't just land, it was trust. But Jody didn't just witness these crimes, she documented them. Before leaving her job, she secretly copied financial records, recorded conversations, where Lois admitted to illegal activities, and preserved emails showing the conspiracy to steal my property. I couldn't sleep at night knowing what she was doing to people. I kept hoping someone else would speak up, but when nobody did, I knew I had to preserve the evidence somehow. She'd been carrying around a flash drive full of incriminating evidence for over a year, waiting for the right moment to come forward. Once Jody's testimony became public knowledge, other residents started coming forward with their own stories of Lois's abuse. Fake violation notices sent to residents who questioned her decisions. Selective enforcement of rules based on personal grudges. Threats to make life difficult for anyone who opposed her agenda. Financial irregularities that board members were told not to investigate. The floodgates opened, and suddenly I realized I wasn't Lois's first victim, just her most recent one. The cabin was just her opening move. She'd built a machine efficient, cruel, and hungry, and I was just the first wrench in its gears. A professional forensic accountant reviewed 5 years of HOA records and uncovered the full scope of the theft. The community landscape enhancement fee was just the latest in a series of fabricated charges designed to generate slush fund money that Lois could embezzle. She'd created fake maintenance assessments, phantom legal fees, and mysterious community improvement charges that existed only on paper. The money had been funneled into accounts that only she controlled, then gradually transferred to her personal finances. Lois hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to claim that I entrapped her and that all HOA actions were good faith community protection measures. During her deposition, Lois tried to maintain that she acted in the community's best interests, and that I was a vindictive outsider who doesn't understand community values. But when Frank played the voice recording, Lois's lawyer froze mid-note. The audio echoed her voice, crisp and calm. "We'll split the difference after escrow closes." It was the sound of someone caught mid-theft. When Frank presented evidence of her secret profit-sharing agreement with her friend Margaret, she couldn't explain why she never disclosed this massive conflict of interest. The deposition transcript shows her literally speechless for over a minute when confronted with her own recorded voice discussing how to split the proceeds from my stolen cabin. The judge scheduled the final hearing for the following Tuesday, and as we left the courthouse, Lois looked defeated and desperate. But I could see something else in her eyes: calculation. She was already planning her next move, probably figuring out how to spin this disaster into someone else's fault. Her expensive attorney was whispering frantically in her ear, probably explaining how much trouble she was really in. As we stepped out of the courthouse, I felt no triumph. Just one question pressing down like a second gavel. What would she do before Tuesday? The courtroom felt overclocked. Journalists packed the benches. HO. Board members shifted in suits 2 sizes too big. This wasn't just a hearing, it was reckoning in real time. Tuesday morning arrived with a tension that felt like electricity in the air. And honestly, I was nervous despite having all the evidence on my side. You never know how these things will go once they're in front of a judge, and Lois's expensive attorney had been making noise about procedural technicalities and jurisdictional challenges. The bailiff had to ask people to stop whispering because the room was buzzing with anticipation. I'd never been the center of this much attention, and it was both thrilling and terrifying at the same time. The judge entered with the kind of presence that made everyone sit up straighter, her black robes flowing like she was carrying the weight of justice itself. Just when everyone thought that they'd heard all the evidence, Frank stood up with one final bombshell. Your Honor, we've recently discovered a document that fundamentally changes this case. He presented the original will of a businessman who established the trust fund that owned the clubhouse. I thought I knew everything about this case by that point, but I was wrong. Even I had no idea how deep Lois's deception really went. And what Frank revealed next made my jaw drop. The courtroom fell completely silent as Frank explained what this document meant, and I could see the judge leaning forward with intense interest. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment, probably realizing she was witnessing legal history in the making. Frank didn't raise his voice. He just read, "To be used in service of the community, not as private gain." The judge leaned forward, Lois leaned back, and everything shifted. The businessman's will filed in 1987, but buried in old county records explicitly stated his intention. The clubhouse should serve the community with minimal rental fees sufficient only to cover basic maintenance, never as a profit-generating enterprise. More importantly, the will showed that any HOA president who knowingly circumvented this community service mission should be immediately removed from office. But here's the smoking gun that sealed Lois's fate. She knew about this will for over 2 years and had a copy in her personal files. Frank had found the copy during the evidence discovery phase with Lois's handwritten notes in the margins discussing how to work around the will's restrictions. A 52-year-old nurse took the witness stand representing dozens of residents, and her testimony was devastating. Your Honor, without Mr. Bishop's courage to fight back, we never would have learned the truth about our own HOA leadership. We trusted this woman with our community and our money, and she betrayed that trust completely. The investigation had uncovered that I wasn't Lois's only victim. The neighbor who moved away suddenly was actually forced out after discovering financial discrepancies. 2 other residents had received fake violation notices after asking inconvenient questions about HOA spending. One elderly couple had been harassed so relentlessly that they sold their home at a loss just to escape. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Anyone who threatened Lois's control was systematically destroyed through fabricated fees, harassment campaigns, and social isolation tactics that would make a prison warden proud. In a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation, Lois took the witness stand and doubled down on her justifications. Your Honor, I protected this community for 15 years. Property values increased 40% under my leadership. Mr. Bishop is an outsider who doesn't understand what we built here. Every decision I made was for the good of the community. But the judge wasn't buying it for a second, and her response was devastating. Mrs. Granger, you may have increased property values, but you built that success on a foundation of lies, theft, and intimidation. A true community leader protects residents, not preys on them. The judge's voice was cold and disgusted, and I could see Lois visibly shrinking in the witness chair. Her expensive attorney tried to object, but the judge shut him down immediately with a look that could have frozen fire. The sentencing delivered justice in every way I could have hoped for. 18 months in county jail for embezzlement and fraud. 3 years probation with community service requirements. I didn't cheer. I just exhaled like I'd been underwater for months. Full restitution to the HOA and affected residents totaling $127,000. Legal fees for my case, $45,000. Punitive damages for defamation and harassment, $25,000. Interest and court costs, $18,000. Lois would have to sell her house to pay the damages, losing the wealth she'd spent years accumulating through illegal means. The judge also ordered a complete audit of every HOA transaction from the past 10 years and mandated that all future financial decisions be subject to independent oversight by a certified accounting firm. Following the businessman's original wishes, the judge ordered the clubhouse to be transferred to a community trust managed by elected residents, not the HOA board. The monthly rent dropped to $500, enough to cover maintenance but not generate profit. I could have kept it, charged rent, held leverage. But I didn't fight for income. I fought to prove that decency doesn't need to send an invoice. Although I could have kept the clubhouse as a money-making rental property, I chose to honor the original community service vision and transferred ownership to the newly created community trust. I never wanted to destroy the HOA or hurt anyone. I just wanted them to follow their own rules and treat people fairly. Sometimes you have to tear down something corrupt to build something better, and that's exactly what happened here, in front of a packed courtroom full of witnesses who would never forget what they saw. The aftermath brought positive changes throughout the community that I never expected. A new HOA board was elected with the nurse as president, focused on transparency and actual community service rather than power games. My cabin ownership was officially and permanently secured with a formal apology from the new board. New transparency rules prevented future financial abuse, and the community established an independent audit system for HOA funds. Regular town halls were instituted where residents could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. For years, this neighborhood smiled through clenched teeth. Now they were clapping. Not for me, but for the version of themselves they'd almost forgotten they could be. The changes went beyond just preventing corruption. They created a real sense of community that had been missing for years under Lois's authoritarian rule. After serving her sentence, Lois moved away in disgrace. She left in silence, cardboard boxes, plastic bins, and a clipboard sticking out like a tombstone. No one waved. I hosted a free barbecue at the clubhouse, now truly belonging to the people who lived there. Neighbors who once shunned me thanked me personally for having the courage they wished they'd had. The most meaningful moment came when my old neighbor Martinez returned for a visit, thanking me for clearing his name and proving he wasn't the troublemaker Lois had branded him. You saved more than your cabin grant. You saved this whole community's soul. Other former residents who'd been driven out also came forward to share their stories, and several actually moved back to the neighborhood. The lake didn't sing. It just breathed like it finally forgave me. Not the hush of fear, but the stillness after a storm that didn't win. And somewhere between the ripples and the rising light, I finally heard it, peace that stayed. Maybe the real lesson here is when you refuse to back down, you don't just protect what's yours. You remind others that they can fight too. If this one hit home or hit a nerve, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if it were your home, your name, your peace? And hey, if you want to support more stories like this, that little thanks button goes a long way. Appreciate you sticking around. Stay sharp out there.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.